Hi. Tonight I'm going to be telling you the story of the Grey Lady, a spirit that haunts the Old Bushmills Distillery. Now, Bushmills is an old town. There's been a settlement there since away in the 12th and 13th century, but it wasn't called Bushmills. It was two settlements. There was a place called Billy and there was a place called Port Cayman. And only later in the 17th century they were brought together to form Bushmills. And the name Bushmills, it was based around the fact that lots of little mills dotted the banks of the River Bush, the great and mighty River Bush. So Bush and Mills together makes Bushmills. And at that time there were 7 mills along it. There were corn mills and flax mills, there was a timber mill and a paper mill. There were 5 distilleries in Bushmills, not only the one that we know today. So it was, in the middle of the 1800s, a thriving little community. And around that time, 1750 and onwards, people were starting to travel through the country, and they had just discovered things like Dunluce Castle, just down the road, and like the Giant's Causeway. So tourism was beginning to be a thing that people engaged in. A lot of people in Bushmills made their living from the tourism that passed through the place. For example, there were 3 hotels in the village in 1760. There was an old couple, let's call them George and Margaret, and they lived right opposite the distillery. If you're in Bushmills today at the main gates, you'll see that there's a shop facing the main gates, and their house was just about there. And they were a retired couple. They were the most devoted and happily married couple. They'd been married for over 40 years, and they lived there quietly, privately, in retirement. They didn't really fancy the hordes of vehicles, cars, charabancs, carriages that came through the village each day. They thought tourism was a nuisance. So they kind of kept to themselves. And do you know what? They were that much in love that if you ever saw George, you for sure saw Margaret. And if you ever saw Margaret, she was with George. They were inseparable, except for one time of day. You see, when they were living their retirement, they adopted a wee dog. Oh, the loveliest wee thing you ever saw. And they loved that wee animal. And every evening after dinner, but before bedtime, George would take the dog out and he would walk through Bushmills, up through the village, on a particular route every night. And he always tried to take in 2 or 3 bends in the river, because the River Bush is a mighty salmon river. And he always hoped that if he turned where the river bends and followed that path, that he may see one of the great Atlantic salmon, having swum halfway across the world, struggling upstream to go to the pool where it had been born. So he always took that route, and on the way home he always took the same route. He went in through the grounds of the Old Bushmills Distillery. In those days, it wasn't all security fenced and gated, and you could pretty much walk right up past the buildings. And he had the wee dog with him every time, and he would walk down through the site. He liked the smell of the malt. He liked that heated smell, that aroma of whiskey being distilled. And it pleased him to do that each evening. And then he would come in and he would settle down for the evening for an hour before going to bed. So this particular night, George set out as usual after dinner, and the wee dog with him. It was a cold night. He pulled his scarf on him, his overcoat, pulled it tightly round him, and pulled his hat down over his ears. And he set off through the village. And Margaret just waited at home the way she did any evening. And you know, after about an hour, there was no sign of George coming back. He hadn't come home. And then she heard a scratching at the door, and she opened up the front door, and sure enough, isn't the wee terrier sitting there on its own without the master. Well, she was really worried now. She pulled a shawl on her and she walked out of the house, and she went up through the village. She knocked at every door. Have you seen George? Have you seen my husband? The wee dog's home without him. And some people had seen him that evening on his usual route. He was a familiar figure to the people of Bushmills. And the last report that she got of him, somebody had seen him heading into the grounds of the distillery. She headed straight for the distillery. She walked up and down through the grounds. She walked behind the storage shed where the great oak barrels stood that would one day take the whiskey across the sea to America and all around the world. She glanced between sheds in little alleyways. There was even a door open into the building, and even though she knew she shouldn't be there, she couldn't stop herself walking inside the building. She paced up and down the floors of the distillery. She walked upstairs and upstairs again. She searched every floor, but there was no George. She never found him. She came home. The next evening, she spent her evening doing exactly the same thing, and the next evening, and the next evening. And it got to be that she became such a familiar sight, walking through the grounds of the distillery, checking alongside the riverbanks, and juking inside the distillery occasionally with a lantern in her hand, hoping against hope that she would find her husband. But she didn't. She lived a long life, and she passed away. Reports started coming after her death of doors being left open in the distillery. You can understand in a distillery, they've tight security. The doors are kept shut when they need to be shut. But doors that were heavily bolted and locked were found swinging open and free. People reported standing in really warm places in the distillery where the whiskey is distilled by boiling and distillation, where the heat in the air would take the breath from you. And yet an icy cold patch appears around people's feet. I visited the distillery myself, and I am not lying when I tell you that I felt someone brush past and touch my shoulder, or it felt like a hand on my shoulder. People driving past the distillery at night have reported seeing the shadow of a female figure in the upper floor with a lantern, or sometimes with a candle. And to this day, the Bushmills Distillery, the workers who work there in the winter, in particular this time around Halloween when the nights are getting darker, and if you're on a shift that finishes at 6 o'clock, you could be working for an hour and a half in the dark. Nobody likes working in Bushmills Distillery in the dark, because the shadow of a lady dressed in grey, wailing and moaning, has been seen walking through the distillery. So, if you get the chance, when we return to more normal times and the distillery's open again for guests, go along and look at the distillery. But be careful that you don't bump into one of the most powerful spirits in Ireland. And I don't mean whiskey.